Hi everyone, this is Lauren Robinson. I'm one of the historians at the Ilion Free Public Library, and today I'm going to talk about the history behind some more of Ilion's religious groups and churches that either aren't around anymore or ones that are still here but might be lesser known around the village. We don't have a lot of information on these churches and groups. We don't even have photos for all of them, but we're hoping that you might be able to help us out if you recognize any of these groups, or maybe you know someone who attended and knows some more information. So if you know more about any of the groups we're about to talk about and want to get in touch with us, we would love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. I'll start with several of the early Methodist groups in Ilion that were around and either dissolved over time or disappeared. If they disappeared, it's either because all evidence of them disappears from the historical records in our collection, or perhaps because these groups were absorbed into other groups and churches in the village, or they relocated outside the village. First, we have the Universalists. This group was around in Ilion by the early 1840s and pooled their funds with the local Methodists in 1841 to build the Union House of Worship that was on the corner of Otsego and 2nd Streets. The Union House was basically a common space for several early church groups in Ilion to congregate and hold services until they each built their own churches. The Universalists were there, the Methodists were there before they built their church, and so were the Episcopalians and the Baptists until they all eventually moved out. Then in 1865, the Baptists bought the property and demolished the Union House to build their own church there. So this photo is actually the same street corner where the Baptist Church in Ilion stands today. After that, the Universalists held services in private residences and used the facilities at the Presbyterian Church for a while. We don't know if they absorbed into another church group or if this group just dissolved over time, but they disappear from our records by the 1870s. As far as we know, they never had their own building after the Union House was demolished, and we don't think they ever had a resident pastor either. There was also a Methodist Protestant church in Ilion at some point that's no longer around. We think it existed in the early 1880s. It was located somewhere on the corner of John and Otsego Streets, and they held services every Sunday. We know W.D. Snyder and A.K.A. Seaman were two of the pastors, and they held camp meetings by the church on Elm Street. Based on those clues, we think the church was located somewhere in the area marked on this map. If you've seen my other videos in this series about Ilion's Methodist Church, this was one of the churches that eventually closed and merged with the church that's currently on the corner of West and 2nd Streets today. Next, we have the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. It was nicknamed the Old Tin Church because it was covered with tin shingles and siding. It was officially incorporated in 1889 and was located where the Ilion Masonic Temple is today, on the corner of 3rd and Morgan Streets. The only other information we know about the Zion Church are some of the pastors' names listed in our records, including an E.B. Briggs, A.V. Dixon, E. Foreman, and a G.C. Carter, along with a few of the charter members. We have one additional source that says this church building was used by a group of local African Americans that were nicknamed the Holy Rollers, but whether or not this was the same group that formed the Zion Church or another group that moved in later is unclear. Here are a couple more images of the church. The postcard on the left shows the church on the far left with its steeple, and it's in the background behind Soldiers Monument in the photo on the right. There was also a group of Free Methodists in Ilion at one point. The dates of this group are fuzzy as well. We know they originally held meetings in Wright's Chapel, which was a room that was over a chicken coop at Amos Wright's home on John Street. At some point, the Free Methodists moves into the old tin church building I just talked about, probably because they needed a larger meeting space. After that, we think this group dissolved over time as the members were absorbed into some of the other churches in Ilion. The photo here is part of a map of Ilion from 1906 in our collection. Amos Wright's home at 59 John Street is inside the red square. His house was right by the road on John Street, and the barn or storehouse that's bordering Otsego Street on this map was likely where his chicken coop and Wright's chapel was. In 1976, the house burned down in a fire, and the property sat vacant for a while. Sometime after 1906, when this map was made, a house renumbering project was done in Ilion. So this address at 59 John Street is actually 179 John Street today. So for comparison, here's the 1906 map from our collection again, compared to modern day. The house would be where the vacant area is in the modern map, and the barn or storehouse where the chicken coop and Wright's chapel were would have bordered Otsego Street, where the row of houses are now. Next, we have the South Ilion Methodist Church. This church was dedicated in May of 1891 and had a congregation of 8,000 members by 1951. Their first pastor was R.E. King, and one of his successors was Reverend Frederick Wood. Reverend Wood was appointed in 1949 and played a big role in growing the congregation size from about 700 in 1949 up to that 8,000 by 1950. He oversaw services for this church as well as an interior renovation in addition to the front of the church and the purchase of a new organ. He also served the North Columbia and Columbia Center churches. Which leads us to our last two churches for this section. The Jesus Never Fails and Columbia Center community churches are still there today. These are current map images from this year. These churches are both located near the town of Columbia, but they're still technically part of the village of Ilion. We don't know very much about either of these churches at the moment, but we think there's a relationship between both places and the South Ilion Methodist Church, since Reverend Wood's charge included the Columbia Center Church. Our research also indicates the two churches on this slide both currently share the same pastor and organist. So if you live in Columbia, New York, or the local area, and you know anything more about these churches to share with us, please let us know. Alright, now let's move on to some of the non-Methodist groups. We'll start with the Christian Alliance Church. We don't know exactly when this group started, just that they kept moving around to a lot of different locations and eventually left the village. They were around sometime before 1936, and two of their charter members were Belle Kiefer and Jenny S. Taylor, if anyone recognizes those names. The group held their first prayer meetings in private homes for several years before moving to a new location on First Street. We think they moved into a larger meeting area that was above something called Cole's Market on 13 First Street. That would have been somewhere inside the yellow box marked on the map. Keep in mind that prior to the urban renewal project in the 1970s, First Street in Ilion was moved over a few feet, so this map is slightly wrong, but this is still roughly where it was back then. Cole's Market was around until the 1950s, when it became a music store called Mohawk Valley Music Sales. After they were at 13 First Street, the Christian Alliance Church group moved into another room located over the Ilion hardware store that was on Main Street. That used to be where Remington Federal Credit Union stands today, where the yellow arrow is on the map here. After that, we know they met in a pool room somewhere in the village, we just don't know where. By 1936, we know they moved into the property at 69 John Street and turned that into their meeting space. They stayed there until 1956, when they finally bought a church building in Frankfort and moved out of the village. Here's a picture of the 69 John Street property. After the Christian Alliance Church moved out, it sat vacant for a while until it was bought sometime in 1967 by a different church group, the Ilion Gospel Tabernacle Church. After they moved in, an addition was added to the building sometime in the 1970s. We think that the first pastor for the tabernacle was Charles Fresco, who moved to Ilion in 1973 and we think two other pastors from the church included a John Ratliff and an Eldon R. Wilson. We don't know when they served, though. This image is from a book and is the only available photo we know of that clearly shows the property being used as a church with the signs at the front entrance. This church is no longer around, but the house is still there. Moving on, there was a German Evangelical church group in Ilion in the late 1800s. They never built a church building for themselves, but it looks like they had intentions to, because they bought land on 2nd Street in 1876. As far as we know, they never did anything with that land, though. Then, in 1885, the group merged with other similar groups in Herkimer, Mohawk, and Frankfurt, and formed a German Lutheran organization that was located somewhere outside the village of Ilion. We know there was also a group called the Ilion Liberal Christian Society that held meetings in the Maben Opera House. The Opera House was built in 1870 and demolished in the early 1970s as part of a big urban renewal project that changed the layout of downtown Ilion. Aside from hosting theater groups and road shows, the Opera House was also used for large group meetings, so it made sense for a religious group without a church building to meet there. We know the group started in 1871, but we don't know how long it was around for or what ultimately happened to this group. We also know that Howard N. Brown was one of the pastors for the group, but we don't know when he served or if he was their first pastor. We've also found a reference to a group of Unitarians in Ilion that preferred to be called liberal Christians. We're not sure if this is the same group, but they supposedly met in a room on the corner of 2nd and Otsego Streets over what used to be Gray and Clayton's grocery store. Today there are some apartments at that location. So either these were two separate groups, or it was the same group and they changed locations at some point. We don't know for sure. And last but not least, we know that the Spiritualist movement had some influence in Ilion, based on a reference to two people, Abner E. Doty and Mrs. Luther Brown of Ilion, that are listed in our collections as membership committee members of the Central New York Association of Spiritualists. We don't have any other references to spiritualism in Ilion, and don't know if they had a specific meeting location in the village, or if the Dotys and Browns were potential leadership figures for the local group. We just don't know. For anybody unfamiliar with spiritualist movement, it was a religious philosophy or idea that cropped up in upstate New York and became really popular around the 1840s up until about the 1920s. It involved the belief in an afterlife and the ability to communicate with spirits of the deceased as a way for the living to seek guidance. Group seances and the use of spiritual medium hosts were pretty common in the practice. So that's the history behind the churches and religious groups in Ilion that aren't around anymore or that still exist but might not be as well known in the village. This information is all based on our research and what we know from our collections at the Ilion Library. I'll give a big shout out to Warren Schultz's book that was published in the 1970s and provides a lot of good information about Ilion's history, as well as the book Prayer and Praise that was published by the Herkimer County Historical Society around the same time. Both of these sources have a lot of information on early church groups if you want to know more, or are researching church history outside of Ilion at all. This is the last part for the Ilion Churches series we've been doing. In our next video, we're moving on to some other historical topics concerning the village, so keep checking in and stay tuned for more content. Before I end this, I just want to say thanks to everyone for listening and the feedback you've been sending us. We're glad you're enjoying these videos, and we're happy we're able to tell you about the village's history and showcase some of the great collection materials we have and work with in our history room at the library. Lastly, if you have any questions or you want to know anything more about any of the church groups in this video, please call or email us. We want to find out more about these churches too. Also, don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates about our programs and services. Bye everyone!